All that to say, when we looked through all of the different ways you could start an educational entity, these were the 10 main steps that we could kind of break down all of those perspectives from. So, from defining your vision and your mission, maybe you're sitting in a coffee shop and you're just creating an ideation of what you want your educational organization to be, all the way down to the launch and operation of your organization. Notice there's a lot of different puzzle pieces and components, which means there's going to be a lot of different personnel that you're working with. Keep that in mind as we go throughout the conversation.
Mm.
Context is key. Understanding what it means to launch a school from the ground up, key personnel and perspectives that we're working with. Context of that alone is key, especially when working in design, especially when outfitting a learning space. Now we have the picture of the Harry Potter series here. If you know me, you know I'm a diehard Harry Potter fan. But all that to say, if just a little bit, if you pick up a book series, unless you are a very interesting human being, you don't start reading the book series on book five. You start reading the book series on book one. So, specifically regarding design and projects and environments, when we walk into a space, we have to understand context from book one. We can't enter in thinking only about book five because we're going to miss the mark, either in terms of design, logistics, culture, communication, the objectives for the space. We're going to miss it. So, setting up our context, right, starting at book one, many psychologists and educational theorists describe spaces and meaning as that meaning has greater impact on the probability of storing information via long-term memory. So the meaning of something has greater impact than just the initial reaction to what that something is. So your context for designing a space is going to give it greater meaning. Your understanding of personnel in that space is going to give it greater meaning. When we look at starting a school from the ground up, here we go, Heather. From a staffing perspective, what does administrative or operational personnel, what does that look like in a school? So, Heather, between you and I, we have, what is it, like 40 something years of like teaching
At least.
experience? Something insane.
Absolutely. Correct. Correct.
So, what has this looked like for you, like in your teaching experience, and what you can like remember from administration and operational personnel? Who did you work with, and what did that look like?
So it varied over the 24 years that I was in the classroom and doing administrative work. Between assistant superintendents, Title III directors, which I was a Title III coordinator, um, working with my content teams, my department chairs, evaluating them, blah, blah, blah. When we look at the staffing perspective, talking about how it relates to the building of a school, it takes varying nuances. So, um, each person has a particular place and a particular post
Role.
in which they
Yeah,
need to fill.
post.
Correct. Correct. Correct.
Yeah, and when I think about like administration or even operational personnel ops,
Mm-hmm.
like I was always in special education, so I never really spoke with my principal. I
Mm-hmm.
always spoke with my director of special education or my IEP
Mm-hmm.
coordinator. And then
Mm-hmm.
even if it was something that had to do with operations, like something in the room, even like technology, furniture, what have you, it would always be those two individuals and not necessarily like I'm going directly to ops, right? Because it's very hard to describe exactly what I need to somebody that might not be in the space. But that
Mm-hmm.
looks different within every
And, you know,
educational.
and when we talk about the entire scope of
Mhm.
the school, you think about your facilities, you think about your your groundskeepers, you think about your maintenance
Yeah.
people, you want to know who those people are. They're your best friends at all times. And you want to make sure that you've got Sally or you've got John to help fix your locked door when you get locked out at 7:50 in the morning and the bell rings at 8:01 and things of that nature. There's multiple levels. There's a huge scaffolding that happens in this entire piece of
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah, and I think of so many different, we'll get into different kinds of schools in a moment, but I think of all the different
Mhm.
kinds of schools, and we might have personnel that operates in similar roles, but depending on the type of educational institution you work in, they're called something completely different. So
Sure.
there might not
Just to
be,
chime in a little, just to
right?
chime in a little bit more on that, I recall when I was working in Kyrene in the 90s, and we had taken a field trip out to the Palo Verde nuclear plant. Okay. And I had several special needs students with me, some of them severe, and I did have a parapro with me. But it ended up being quite an interesting situation. We all know that some children with specific autistic needs have to have a specific timeline. They have to have everything happen exactly as it's planned at exactly the time in which we state it's going to occur. Well, at the
Yes.
Palo Verde nuclear plant, that did not happen. And so we had quite a situation. I ended up staying, and if you don't know where Palo Verde is, it's about an hour and a half west of Phoenix in the middle of the desert. It is a nuclear power plant. I stayed with the child. As a result, the entire transportation system for the entire school district was disrupted because my 3 school buses carrying 150 kids was not making it back to Chandler on time. So,
Yeah.
you look at a couple things. Transportation, they run everything.
Yes.
Things don't go as planned. Things can get quite hairy, and the disruption can be absolutely insane. Needless to say, I drove home with the mother and the child all the way back. So that was quite
Well,
an adventure, just to throw that out there.
and talk about different roles. Like in that moment, you were facilitator, you were also para, you were one-on-one support, you were coordinator, you were family coordinator, you were
All
all
the
of the
different
above,
sombreros, all the
right?
different hats. Yeah, all the different hats. Yes,
So
it's like that
in
every day.
thinking about all these entities, right? You have transportation, operations, academic administration, you have like community administration, you have instructional staff, you have all of these people all doing very important things. So
Yes.
who are the key decision makers regarding development and projects? That's like one of the most asked questions that I usually get in doing development for those in distribution or those in design. Like, who are the key decision makers? And it really honestly depends on the type of educational institution. So, Heather, I'm going to let you go
Mhm.
ahead.
Certainly so. Um, depending on your level of understanding, when we look at, for example, the administrative team of a school, right, consists of a principal, an assistant principal, director of special ed, all of the department chairs, blah, 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 counselors, etc. But, the degree of influence that the administrative team on site based
Yeah.
actually is not as influential or profound as one may think. When schools are being built, when I was working in Forsyth County, Georgia, the schools were just going up like, hotcakes, basically. Several new schools, several new builds every year. The population's just exponentially growing. But really, the principal and the entire administrative team does not have the ability to say, well, you know what, we would like this type of a table, or we would like to ensure that the
Yep.
gym has this type of a flooring, or what have you. So if you're not aware, you might think that they might have some influence, but really we go to
Right.
the district level, we go to facilities, we go to operations managers, we go to the
Yep.
construction team, things of
Yep.
that nature.
And then thinking about all of the administrative personnel that you named, in the education world, those individuals are usually called a school's LT or a school's
Hmm.
leadership team.
Yep.
So you have like an LT, which is a leadership team. You have a PLC, which is the professional learning team, which is something
Hmm.
completely different. And all of those stakeholders have a perspective
Hmm.
regarding their environment. And
Now it's
then
not, yeah, and it's not that they're ignored. I'm sure that
no.
input's given. There's so many committees. There's, you know, parent committees, student committees, teacher committees, blah, blah, blah. They're all committees and they all have some sort of a say, but that is a quote unquote. It
Right.
is just a sharing of thoughts on, well, we would love to have this, or we would love to have this be a part of what we're developing and creating.
Mhm.
So it's more of not for show. The input is so important, but the input I don't think is as significant as one may assume.
As one may assume. And it also depends on the type of entity. So here we have a
Correct.
list, and this is not an all-encompassing list of
Mm-mm.
educational organizations in the United States of America. So if you've
Mhm.
never heard some of these before, look them up in your area. I promise you they exist, but we have private and or independent, and they can be one and the same or two different things. We have public, we have charter, specialty schools like a school for the deaf, a school for the blind, another specialty school. We have parochial schools, which is a type of private school. We have colleges, universities, trade schools, and alternative schools. We're probably missing like six more. But
Mhm.
this is, and just to give an idea, every leadership team in one of these types of institutions looks different. It looks very different, and the key decision makers are going to be different. So
Mhm.
again, so that we're not entering on book five, so that we have an understanding of book one, right? Building our context for design, we have to understand what type of institution is this? Who are the key decision makers and what's important to them? What's important to that population? What's important to their culture? What's important to that mission and vision of how they created that school? So, we're going to focus specifically for personnel conversations. We're going to focus on like the two most well-known types of educational institutions, public schools and charter schools. And specifically operations directors or operations teams. Because when you're doing a project, no matter if it's for a brand new school, a brand new build, or an existing school, you're going to work with an operations team. So Heather is going to talk about and answer a variety of these questions regarding operations teams.
Absolutely. So I put together a little sharing of information and I chose public versus charter not because they're so very different, but in some ways they are. And I felt that it was important to just kind of highlight what really happens and what really transpires in building a charter school versus building a public school. How do these roles vary? What variances affect each step of the process? And then
Mhm.
how we as design teams, as manufacturers, as reps, as dealers, how are we catering to meet the needs of both
Yeah.
at the same time? Mhm.
Yeah, which can be tricky.
Sure. So what I did was put together a little graphic organizer highlighting operation managers in public school settings, and then we're going to roll over to the charter school. Basically, there are 7 steps within the public school setting, okay? And the difference is we're dealing with an entirely different level of funding. We are dealing with an entirely different level of scaffolding in the process. And I
Mhm.
know we can all read, so I'm not going to bore you by going through each and every one of these. I just want to hone upon a few. Clearly, we always start with the pre-construction planning. That
Mhm.
happens for both charter and public. The compliance oversight. What are we looking at for zoning? What are we looking at
My
for studies?
gosh.
What are we looking at for permits? What are we looking at with architects? Okay.
Mhm.
Then we go into the vendor and contractor management. Again, we'll talk about the variance with charter. Within the public school, there is a much different process. You have to go within who your vendors are. You have to go within then to the school board. You have to get approvals, blah, 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 blah. What's resource coordination look like? Well, that's going to be pulling all these pieces together. How are we pulling in and creating our team with regards to procurements, with construction materials? Who's our electricians? Who's our HVAC? And again, this is all at the district level. The teacher has nothing to do with this. The principal, nothing, nada, por nada, right? But all of these pieces, particularly when it comes to quality control, this
Yeah.
is where it varies. Okay, quality control and safety, the district level personnel have a very explicit set of guidelines in which they need to follow at all times. The types of approvals that they need. Talk about budget and timeline. The school districts already have their budget, right? They know what they have. Do they have bond money? Yes. Can they use Title I money to build a school? No. Okay. What's our stakeholder communication? Who are we communicating with? Clearly, at the public school level, again, our community involvement, our vendor involvement, things of that nature. So when we roll over, and there's more to this, but again, I would just wanted to give an overview. Let's
Yeah.
roll over to the charter school because I want to touch upon a few different things. When we're dealing with charter schools, we're dealing with a completely different authorization and compliance process.
Yes.
Charter schools are given state and federal funding. They are given special licenses in which to operate. Their funding and budget management is a completely different wave per se.
Yeah.
Okay. When we talk about funding for a charter school, yes, they're getting federal and state funding. Well, they're also getting investors. They're
Yeah.
also getting philanthropic donations. They're getting community liaisons, commercial opportunists that would like to have their name on their school, stadium, you know,
Exactly.
billboard, etc. Um, Integration for educational programming is at their leisure. It is at their specific demand. We have seen just such an uptick in particularly the autism schools opening,
Yes.
all the different special needs schools opening, different CTE primarily opening, right? And those have their own curriculum, their own standards, their own way of operation. And they use the Arizona standards, or they use the Texas standards, or they use the Pennsylvania standards, but they can really do what they want based on the charter guidelines.
Yeah.
Another variance that's really important is the rapid timeline management. When we're dealing with charter schools, we are looking at 99% are not built from the ground up.
Right.
They are smaller institutions. They are purchasing a doctor's office or a commercial business office, and they're
Yeah.
turning it into a mini micro school. So what
Yeah.
does that look like? Rapid timeline management means that you will have a investor or a founder or a CEO of a charter school that says, guess what? We've got to put this together in 8 weeks,
Yeah.
not 8 months, not 10 months, 8 weeks. So having people in place within that committee, your founder, your CEO, your investors, all of that goes into a rapid timeline management, which is imperative to get that off the ground. But that's
Yeah.
also the luxury, is because they can make that happen. They don't have
Yeah.
to go through those scaffolding pieces that the public school has to. When we talk about technology infrastructure, what are the IT people bringing? How are they implementing the technology? What are
Mhm.
they doing to ensure that the charter school child is getting that same opportunity, that same opening, that same exposure? Because it does look different. Clearly, when we talk about community engagement, you've got parents that are specifically wanting a specific solution for
Yeah.
their child, for what is in the child's best interest, for what specific, absolutely honing in on that child's need. And
Yeah.
they have the luxury of being able to do that for free, right?
What's
I want to
interesting,
talk.
Heather, about like both sets as you're kind of explaining the different steps or different waves of planning and what
Mhm.
operations looks like in general, a couple of things come to mind. So I live in the Bronx and I know that not everyone lives near as a robust Department of Education system as New York City. But
Mhm.
just in thinking about where I live, there's in the NYC DOE, there's almost 2,000 schools. And that's like
Mhm.
special education, general education schools. And in terms of like starting a new school, project management, compliance, like all of the layers that you're talking about, we have maybe like one building and then we have four different schools in that same building.
Sure,
So
sure.
like the first two floors is one school, the next two floors is another school, and it's because our city is built up, right? And you're
Right.
in a more rural area, all of the schools are spread out. And then
Hmm.
sometimes, going back to authorization, zoning, and compliancy, sometimes a district is by county, sometimes it's by
Sure.
zone, sometimes it's by region,
Yep.
sometimes it's by, and you don't need to have a foundational, like inner knowledge working of all of these processes. However, again, when we enter to do a project, when we enter to assist with a design, when we enter to bring in resources, having an understanding of how all of these steps work together would
Hmm.
greatly benefit conversations around design,
Absolutely.
around procurement, and it would greatly benefit the building of trust between relationship between
And that, yeah.
architect, yeah, designer, yeah,
That's such an interesting segue when we look at like regulatory navigation, for example, thinking about those buildings in the Bronx, right? They
yep,
all have very specific zoning laws, building
hmm,
codes, fire codes, environmental regulations. Those look completely different. When you
yeah,
go and mention what you stated, like when I was in Georgia, Gwinnett County, biggest county, Forsyth County, you've got 300,000 students in
yep,
one school district, right? That is a completely different, I'm not going to say bear, right? But then you look at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They have 45, more than 45 school districts in Allegheny County that I was the Title III director for.
yeah,
And they had 1,200 students with a superintendent every 10 miles.
right,
Okay. So when you talk about financial obligations and financial considerations, it's just such a different beast.
yeah,
Back to the charter though, what's also very interesting, which they can maneuver around much better and much more fluid and more flowing per se, and much more fluid, have more fluidity, is with
yeah,
that regulatory navigation. They have smaller spaces. However, they do have different and more distinctive and harsh,
yeah,
more challenging regulations,
yep,
because these buildings, maybe they're built within a complex, maybe they're built a mile from a school. There are all different variations that go into this. So, I think that kind of sums it up. Again, I'm not
yeah.
just going to read to you people here today, um, but we kind of gave it a good overview and a good, comparison.
Well, and when we get approached for projects, and I find out specifically it's for a charter school, I go, okay, I have this entire new way of understanding because I taught in charter for over a
Mhm.
decade, and one of my classrooms was technically like the boiler room, and another classroom was basically like they tore
A
down a
closet,
wall. Yeah, they tore
a
down a
closet.
wall between like a corridor and
Hmm.
a closet, and then there's like these pipes everywhere. So there, compliancy and like how like overall spatial design is completely different in those
Yeah,
types of buildings. Um,
for
one was
certain.
one was like a refurbished parking garage, and like that's
Yeah.
just what you do.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've come to, in taking all of our information on setting up a school, and considering personnel, we've come to our first pour over. So let's see what we got. So within a school district or network, who is the main decision maker? The principal, the superintendent, the business administrator, operations director, or a combination of personnel. So we are going to go ahead and release the poll. What do you guys think? Who is that key decision maker when you're going in to do a design, when you're going in to do a project? Okay. We have conflicting views. I love the fact that you guys can't see everybody answering, but we have some that say principal, we have some that say business administrator. Y'all, don't sleep on the business administrator. They're the person that writes you the check. Okay, here we go. Well, you're about to find out, was it the principal or was it the business administrator? Actually, it is a combination of personnel. And sometimes, depending on like how Heather highlighted, if it's a public, if it's a charter, or any institution that we discussed, it could be all of the above or only
Mhm.
one, depending on who you're talking to.
Mhm.
Which brings us to, we're going to get into some design elements now. Or how does this connect to design? So we talked about operation.
This is so amazing. I just am
I know.
so excited about this next little piece.
Well, because there's so many deep-rooted connections that you wouldn't stop to think about unless you stop to think about. So
Mhm.
when we consider all of the context that we just learned, right? Consider that book one and book two. We've read book one, book two. We're now like on book three, right? In our series of literature. Now that we know all of the personnel, how it differentiates based on organization, well, who's driving the bus? And what does their map look like? Because some people out there using Waze, some people out there still downloading MapQuest. I don't know what you guys are using, but what does our map look like? So we have a couple of fun graphics to discuss. When you think about a principal, kind of how Heather stated, they know how to navigate their ship, like their school. If there's 72 schools in a district, a lot of times there's principal turnover. Or they take one principal from one school and 2 years later put him at a different school, and a year later put him at a different school, and a year later put. So, this is the understanding that a principal needs to have. In order to be a principal, you need to know how to drive a Ford because I need to know all of the inner workings of this steering wheel, but I also need to know how to like go to Enterprise and rent a different car if I go to a different building, right? When you rent a car, I know where the hazards are. I know where the starter is. I know where the pedals are. I have a basic understanding of how to run my ship. Then you get into specialty leaders like a director of special education. This is probably what their steering wheel looks like. So not only am I, driving a ship or running the ship, but I have a lot more nuance to how I need to operate my ship. I have a slew of different compliances that I need to adhere to. I have a slew of staff members that their development is differentiated from all other staff members. I also had to have a robust understanding of the needs of the kids that are in my program in order to make my best recommendations. I also have to deal with outside legal entities and supports like a committee of special education and like IEP coordinators. Well, so we have our principal, we have another personnel in our leadership team. Well, then this is an operations director. So when you're talking to an operations director about a project, they might not have all inner workings that the principal has or the director of special education has, but guess what? They have to understand them. They might
Mhm.
not have all full knowledge, but they have to have a basic understanding. Because when the operations team is maneuvering and manipulating throughout the physical space, they have to have a basic awareness and understanding of what's actually going on and how people are communicating and how people are maneuvering. Some of the toughest projects I think that I've worked on is working with a steering committee of people that are all exceedingly well intended, but that don't have an understanding of what the other person does. That probably makes for the most difficult kind of project.
We look at that, Hannah, just to touch
Yeah.
upon that very briefly. Attending the AASBO conference in Laughlin in April
Mhm.
was just such an eye-opening experience for me. Learning about specific codes, learning about specific procurements, how they function, what are the steps involved. what is actually goes into quality control. What do
Mhm.
inspectors really do? What are they looking for? The safety compliance issues. It taught me so much.
Yep.
Environmental regulation, it was truly an eye-opening opportunity for me of learning when it comes to what these facilities and operations coordinators are actually dealing with on a
Yeah.
day-to-day basis, not just in the function and the maintenance of their current buildings, but in what they're doing for their new builds, their rebuilds, their reconstructs, their upgrades, etc.
And don't assume, like, if you are a project manager, you work in design or distribution, like, the assumption that everybody understands what's going on is not an assumption we should have. When you go to school to become a teacher, you aren't unaware of the procurement process. You are not
Correct.
explicitly taught. So, my first encounter with that as a special education teacher, I just needed one dang standing table. I needed a variation of height. And I kid you not, I talked about it at the beginning of the academic year, and I think it was maybe like May. And I was like, guys, it's one
Yes.
thing. I just need the one thing. But what's
Yep.
really hard is if we don't have those conversations or we don't understand the red tape, then it becomes like this compartmentalization of these people against this
Sure.
department of these people, right? So we have
Absolutely.
all of our logistical information that we just covered. Y'all did great. Whew, that was a lot. Now, there's also another umbrella to consider when we're doing projects and design. We have all of the logistics of starting a school from the ground up. What does that look like? Who's driving the bus? Personnel. Well, guess what? There's a whole other side of that coin, and it's all of the cultural components. It's
Mhm.
all of the ideologies, the characteristics that distinguish that type of school. So when you're being set up for success, you have to, in a project, thinking about what is the organization's overall goal or objective. Something as simple as actually viewing the school's mission and vision statements before creating a design, understanding their personnel, like we just did a deep dive, understanding their organizational structure, as Heather was highlighting. Not all leadership teams are decision makers. Having an awareness of different contents or different methodologies, right? How are people teaching? What is the key or core structure of their teaching framework? And then understanding different departments' ideologies. Like Heather highlighted, an individual in the CTE department might not have the same perspective or priorities as somebody in like an ELL or an English language learner's role. They're going to have very distinct priorities. So when we connect the two, all of our logistical information, which with all of our cultural information, this is what this looks like. So understanding an organization's goal and objective allows you to know who's the decision maker. Understanding their personnel allows you to know how are they going to view the space. Knowing things like their structure, their culture, their methodology, it will allow you to design where something's connected to the goal, where the layout is connected to their ecosystem culture, where the specific pieces you recommend allows them to easily connect to their curriculum, to their content. So it works together in this beautiful, seamless, for the lack of a better word, design marriage. And if you don't have both, it is not going to work. If you
Mhm.
don't have an understanding of both, it might be an aesthetically pleasing space, but it's not going to fully connect with what they're trying to do. On the other hand, it might connect with their budget and their logistics, but that doesn't carry over to their curriculum or how they're operating in a space. You need
Yeah,
both.
the implementation. Yep.
Yep. Okay, so our last pour over. What is the most common pitfall of project managers regarding learning environments or the design of learning environments? Do they lack context? Do they lack time, overall understanding, the allocation of budget, or is it a combination of one of those? So I'm going to release the poll. I'm really curious at this point.
No, and I have something I would like to do as a little add-on after this little pour over question.
I'm so ready. All right, the most common pitfall of project managers. Do they not have context, time, overall understanding, like budget awareness, or a combination of those above? Ooh. See, I feel as though during pour over two, we get like a little bit more like aware of like
Uh-huh.
how we set up the questions. Yes, you guys got it. Here we go. It is a combination. It's usually a combination of one of those buckets. But when you look at those buckets, you can actually take that list with you when you do a walkthrough of a site. Do I understand their context, their timeline? Do I have an overall understanding of the culture of the institution? Do I have an awareness of budget? That's your checklist, right? That's basically your project management checklist.
And this is where I just wanted to step in quickly and state that this is where that gap
Mm-hmm.
lies. This is where the gap lies because we have people making decisions about classroom design that have never stepped foot in a classroom. This is why it is imperative for us as manufacturers, as rep groups, as dealers to understand the why, understand how important the design is, why this
Mm-hmm.
piece should go here, why this piece should go here, why this one maybe belongs in higher ed, but this one absolutely would work well with a fourth,
Right.
sixth classroom. And
Yeah.
having us provide that knowledge to have all of our constituents and all of our stakeholders and all of our partners that are
Yep.
collaborating together assist these upper level district managers that are facility directors, operation
Mhm.
coordinators, blah, 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 that don't have a clue
Yeah.
of
Well, and
what actually is transpiring on a minute by minute time period in a classroom, whether it's a 10th grade
literally.
US history, whether it's a third grade uh self, self contained.
Yep.
It's really, really important that all of us are collaborating and working together and getting the knowledge out there to all of our parties involved
Yeah.
as far as assisting with that when these purchases are being made.
Well, and there's underlying truths of human development that live in any kind of design for any kind of space, right? The psychological truth that straight lines versus curvature, that
Hmm.
they draw two different reactions and outcomes in a space. Lighting, biophilic integration.
Hmm.
Like there's underlying foundational developmental truths, but understanding the overall logistics and culture of an organization will allow you to take those underlining truths and really like drive it home. So
Hmm.
as you're going out into the field, or even if you're a superintendent and you are, sitting in your office or you have capital projects coming up, these are really three helpful questions to consider before starting to make recommendations, right? So, what is the overall cultural, academic, and community goals of the organization? And it's a more reflective question, but it's a foundational question. What is the overall cultural, and restorative programming of the organization? So every school, no matter what kind of entity you are, has a behavioral program. They have a communication program, every single one, because they have to track it and they use it as measurement criteria. So, what is it? And how can the environment impact that? How can the design spaces meet an organization's cultural, academic, and community needs? These are foundational questions that it's not a, well, maybe I should ask them. No, it's like, it's an overall must anytime you have a project, no matter how small or how big. What is happening in the space? Sometimes when we work on a project, it's like, oh, it's fourth grade, there's 27 kids, this is the seat height, I need X amount of work surfaces, bada bing, bada boom. And that's it. Okay, but like what are they doing? And why are they doing it? Going back to that quote at the beginning of our conversation, meaning is the most important aspect of what we're doing. When we have greater meaning, we have greater long-term working memory. Who's in the space? Because depending on the age group and the type of building, it might be a bunch of different people. And how Is the space going to adapt within the next 3, 5, 7, 10? And if you're a public school working on a bond, 30 something years, right? You're not just designing for like the next 12 months. You're designing for kids that will come into the space that honestly aren't even born yet. And that's
Mhm,
wild to think about.
mhm,
So, we've talked about logistics, personnel, we've talked about culture, design questions or project management questions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to connect all of that understanding with some very basic design and methodology integration. Here's what we mean. Heather and I have put together a list of very popular frameworks, teaching methodologies, types of curriculum, so that you'll see on the left hand side, with a visual, a helpful visual on the right hand side. So, early education, the babies. And don't get it twisted, guys. Kindergarten is technically still a part of early education. They're not technically elementary school. They are EE 100%. Some types of popular frameworks or methodologies we have is Montessori, Walford, Goddard, Reggio Emilia, and these instructors have been trained to the T on these frameworks.
mhm,
So if you get a request to do a project, no matter how small or how big, for an early education entity, it is our high recommendation that you take this list and just familiarize yourself with the verbiage. Familiarize yourself with one important priority from each of these frameworks. When we look at the visual, a lot of what these frameworks have in common is they are exploration based, independent based, and center based. All that to say, all of the spaces for early education are designed for the sake of agency of the child
mhm,
and not necessarily that the adult is doing for.
mhm,
And that is a basic framework in many, many early education entities.
mhm.
Elementary, we're graduating a little bit, right? Some common frameworks that we have: backwards design, where we're planning with the end in mind, universal design for learning. How are we sharing information in a variety of ways and allow kids to express that in a variety of ways? We have project based learning or interdisciplinary learning. There are whole schools that have science and music happening at the same time. So when they learn about anatomy, like of the ear, they're also learning via sound. That's interdisciplinary learning. We have whole language learning. Heather, you want to touch on whole language learning?
Basically, what we do is we just take each piece of the content, right? And we devise our methodologies of instruction and implementation based around all of those components
Mhm.
so that they are all marrying and they're all mirroring.
Oh, I love that. Marrying and mirroring. Write that down. And then we have whole brain learning, which means that we're utilizing our entire body to be able to remember something. We might have a motion, we might have a song, we might get up, we might walk around. It is whole brain learning. One of the key takeaways for this age group and all of these different kinds of frameworks is that in elementary school, so grades 1 through 5, in some states 6, it is still based on modeling. Whether that's the adult modeling something or a peer modeling something, it is very much I see something and experience it with my eyes, my ears, my voice, my hands, my body, and then I try it. That is like the basic framework of elementary. So all of our design elements allow us to come together to discuss and view modeling and then separate to attempt to do that on our own. Heather, you want to take over middle school, high school? That's your
Sure.
wheelhouse.
When you get to this age group, if you teach middle school as I have, you're either crazy or you really do love kids. And it is it was one of the most amazing experiences that I had. My first year teaching middle school, we had a 2-year team. So not only did I have them as seventh graders, I had them as eighth graders. And they're either wonderful or you're running out of the building and never coming back. When we look at different types of design for middle and high, we want to understand where their brains really are. And that is so incredibly important to their academic success.
Yeah.
Uh, yes, we still have backwards design. Yes, we have universal design. Universal design looks a little bit different. When
Right.
you get to middle and high school, you're starting to do adult things. You're looking at Socratic seminars. You're doing total physical response in your modern language classrooms. You're up and moving. You're reacting. You're mimicking. When we talk about debates at middle school, they must be extremely organized. What type of design, what type of furniture are we implementing in these spaces to accommodate these
Yeah.
activities? It's imperative. It's
Well,
imperative.
and again, going back to previous coffee talks, they might do Socratic seminar, Harkness, like democracy style conversation, debate, total. They might do all of that in one day. They might
Oh,
do
absolutely.
every single one of
Absolutely.
those activities within like a 4 to 5 hour time period.
Yep,
And so
absolutely.
how the shapes of our design come together, break apart, reconfigure, we have to consider the framework of how the teaching method looks in the space and how the communication method looks in the space.
And what's also important is the fact of, as we are getting furniture and design pieces into these schools, we need to look at things like, are they on a block schedule? Are
Right.
they in the same classroom for an hour and a half, three different times? This has a huge impact on clearly instruction,
Yeah.
clearly academic success, but also what pieces are in these spaces that are the most appropriate to accommodate children that are in a classroom for an hour and a half instead of a 50-minute period, right? It's extremely important.
It's extremely important. And again, like what you're stating is the cusp of what we're talking about, right? Like considering the logistical understanding of an organization. And
Mhm.
then this is like the pedagogical, cultural understanding of it all comes together. It's not
Yeah, I mean, even
either
for high
or.
school students, we know that uh the ability, the attention span is based on age. So even for middle and high school, educators are mixing it up every 17 minutes, every
Yeah.
14 minutes based on age. And if they're not, what do you have? You have children sitting there completely checked out, whether they're in a scatty or whether they're in a scofa or whether they're in a traditional desk, it's not going to matter,
Right,
right?
exactly. And we know from certain pilot studies and case studies that the more you integrate a design that mirrors the framework of what's happening in the room, the higher
Mhm.
the engagement and the less amount of referrals.
Absolutely. Mhm.
All right, we cannot forget higher ed.
Mhm.
Although in my mind, y'all are still kids, it's okay. We cannot forget higher ed. So higher ed, we yes and. So we have yes to all of the above because guess what? Once you get to higher education, we don't lose project-based learning. We don't lose whole brain learning. We don't lose any of the modeling. It just looks very different, and then we tack
Yeah.
and we tack on top of
Mhm.
that. So whether
It's
it's
just
a
so much more
lecture,
elevated,
it's a
so
little bit
much more
more elevated.
elevated.
hmm Whether it's lecture, learning hubs, practicums, observations, research projects, capstones, whatever it is at that specific institution, it will take all of these different kinds of frameworks and input them in maybe one type of seminar. Because seminars sometimes are what, almost 3 hours long. So you might integrate all different kinds of frameworks in that 3 hour period. And then as learners, adult learners, the expectation is that we can easily transition between the different frameworks. And our environment can
Yeah.
help us do that.
Thinking about how important commons are, right? The common spaces in
Gosh.
which we are designing and furnishing. Because, the professor will say, okay, you guys just go ahead and handle it off on your own. And having that situational space for the students in which to commingle, partner, and work together is really critical.
Well, and think about it. Like, I love what you just said. Given the example of the professor saying, like, all right, y'all, bye, like, get after it, like, get out, basically, right? Like, your lecture is done. But then I think about the fact that we have eighth grade classrooms that are all individual desks and rows. And even if they're not, even if it's pods or circles or what have you, the idea that I need to assign you where you go. So when eighth graders transition to high schoolers go in, they're switching classes almost every period. I also potentially will get assigned where I go. Well, then you go to higher ed. Nobody's telling you where to go. Nobody's telling you where to sit. Nobody's telling you how to start your homework. Nobody's telling you how to manage your time. No one's telling you how to. So,
Yeah.
futuristically thinking, the design and implementation of that design actually helps individuals transition from an eighth grade mindset all the way through to a higher ed, trade school, specialty school mindset. It's a complete mind shift.
Mhm.
Whoa, whirlwind conversation. So, as a recap, when we're doing projects, when we're designing for educational entities, it's very important that we're not entering on book five. We have to have a basic logistical understanding and a cultural understanding of what we're doing and who we're doing it for and the meaning behind it all. When you have those puzzle pieces all come together, the design works itself out. The design will communicate to you or the user or the stakeholder what needs to happen.